So welcome to the Morris Federation series of talks and workshops during lockdown. And today we have a talk by the Adderbury Morris Men, and the MC is going to be Keith Norton. And first, I've been asked to share this video with you.
How happy is that man that's free from all care, who loves to make merry, who loves to make merry, or a drop of good beer.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Norton, and I'm the bag for the Adderbury Morris Men. On the 26th of April, 1975, 95 years since the demise of Adderbury Morris seemed to spring fully formed into the world again. Of course, that's not the real story, and we're going to talk about the revival and what was behind it as we go through today. You've been watching some of the original footage from the first day of dance. And as you've seen, this footage only came to light in September 2018. Although Les Lister lived in the village, he was not a member of the Morris side, just a spectator on the day. It makes one wonder what else might still be out there waiting to be discovered. The snippet comes from a much longer silent film, which you can find on the Adderbury Morris Men's YouTube channel, along with other videos from 1975 to the present day. What follows is the story behind the 1975 revival of Morris dancing in Adderbury and how it has developed over the years. There'll be some videos and live music along the way and a question and answer session at the end. So if you've got any questions, please send them directly to me via the chat function and we'll pick them up at the end of the presentation. We hope you enjoy it. I will now hand over to Stephen Wass to talk about the history of Morris dancing in Adderbury and the surrounding area before the 20th century.
Okay, thank you, Keith. I'm going to take over sharing screen and hopefully we'll have a bit of a slideshow about to come its way. And here we go. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to kick off this afternoon's session with just a little bit of background about the location and its early history to sort of set the scene, as I said. So for those who know it, today Adderbury is a large village in the wilds, as we like to say, of North Oxfordshire, just a couple of miles south of the former market town of Banbury. A few years ago, there was an attempt to market Banbury as the gateway to the Cotswolds. But most people at the time thought this was stretching the point a little. Mind you, geologically, if not culturally, these uplands north of Banbury, based on an iron-rich limestone, are in effect the last gasp of the Cotswold Hills before they vanish away into the lowlands of Northamptonshire. Historically, the area was known as an agriculturally productive one with rich soils and distinctive ironstone villages, of which, of course, Adderbury is one. The village probably originated in the Saxon period, and there's a reference from the 990s in a charter naming it rather wonderfully Eadburg Egburg, and it flourished through the Middle Ages when it was in the hands of the bishops of Winchester. One of the products of this ownership was the fine church of St. Mary the Virgin, with its memorable frieze of medieval musicians and monsters. although you can't always tell the difference. Their early open fields were enclosed in the 18th century, when the settlement got something of a reputation as being a gentry village, in the sense the leading landowners controlled the livelihoods and social lives of their tenants quite closely. The canal arrived nearby in the 1790s and the railway in 1887. And this is the background of the village where Morris dancing was and is such a notable feature. There's no clear evidence as to when the Morris was first performed in Adderbury. Keith Chandler suggests the possibility of dancing late in the 18th century as a foundation for the subsequent heyday in the middle of the 19th century. But of course, it's perfectly possible that from the late Middle Ages through the 16th and 17th centuries, Morris-related activities associated with the church and then the local gentry could have been seen in the village. In writing of the dancers from Ayno and King Sutton, just down the road from Adderbury, John Forrest records how the Cartwright family sponsored performances in the early 18th century, but no Adderbury team is mentioned. It's likely that it was the 18th century that saw the development of Cotswold Morris as a regional tradition, as opposed to an earlier widespread national pastime. And as a result of this, well-known groups were established in the surrounding villages, notably Badby, first recorded as active from the 1850s, Brackley undoubtedly in actions from the 1720s, Bucknell possibly performing from the 1800s, Kirtlington from the opening decades of the 18th century, Aynsham, Ducklington, the Witchwoods, and of course Bampton from early in the 19th century. And they're not forgetting Ilmington up in Warwickshire, with possible performances recorded again from the 18th century. Closer to home, many of the settlements in the immediate vicinity, including Ayno, Bloxham, Deddington, Dunstew, King Sutton, Sidford, Solden, Swaycliffe, and Tadmartin, had less well-documented performances. The fact there was an active Morris culture within walking distance of Adderbury hints at something of the links and indeed cross-fertilisation between dancing groups within North Oxfordshire. We know, for example, that Fred Webb from Bloxham, who may have had an association with Adderbury, was originally from Loughborough. Similarly, it's also recorded that musicians could be extremely well travelled, with Joseph Woods of Deddington and Dunstew, as well as James Blencoe of King Sutton, providing musical accompaniment on the pipe and tabor. Whilst the fool William Castle, also known as Old Metal, regularly made the trek out from Banbury to appear in nearby villages. However, it's clear that the mainstay of Morris within the village was a fairly small number of core families, preeminent amongst them the Waltons, who at one point Chandler suggests could have had 3 generations dancing together, as well as supplying 5 brothers. In addition, there were the Blackwells, the Hawkins, the Flints, the Dorsets, the Wyatts, the Townsends, and the Lines, all families who maintained the tradition to the point where around the middle of the 19th century, Chandler suggests they could have put up 3 sets of dancers. The recorded context for performing in Adderbury was a club day. Derived from older fundraising church ales, these events combine music, dancing, processions, dressing up, eating, and of course drinking, as a general celebration of community life, albeit usually closely overseen by the local gentry. Another setting for performance, known to have been current in the area, was the idea of a tour, either to attend the fairs and markets of the local town, as Adderbury almost certainly did in the 1830s and 1840s, as described by George Herbert in his memoir, The Shoemaker's Window, or simply to visit neighbouring villages, on the tramp as it were. Sometimes there'd be commissions to dance at the great houses, and occasionally groups would meet up to dance against each other. Unfortunately, none of the reports available of actual dancing in Adderbury have any of the drama of this account from Bloxham, 3 miles to the west of the village, where we come across the celebrated Banbury character of Old Metal. It was noted that village tradition tells of a famous squire called Old Metal, who made a good deal of money by dancing. One of his most telling jokes among a purely agricultural population was that he knew plenty of bigger fools than himself, those standing round him, for they worked for their living and he didn't. He made witty remarks and had a sack stick with a calf's tail at one end and a bullock's bladder blown out and having a handful of peas inside. He asked riddles and knocked the boys with resounding bangs over the head with a bladder. Bloxham and Solden danced against one another at the former place. The crowd was judging, as may be imagined. Bloxham won, though Solden had the best dancers. Bloxham had the best clown, and that took the people. It's appropriate to take a few moments, therefore, to consider the role of one William Castle. Old Metal, as his career remains one of the better documented ones amongst Morris performers from the period. He was born in Adderbury in the winter of 1792, the son of John and Anne Castle. His father, who was a weaver, died in 1799 when William was just 6. And it looks as if William was born with a serious inherited health issue, probably a neurological condition known as Mobius's syndrome that paralyzes the facial muscles and is often accompanied by lameness. The challenges his mother faced in bringing him up must have been formidable. Indeed, the circumstances of his upbringing may well explain what Chandler calls Castle's subsequent rambling and independent existence. At some point, he moved to Banbury, where he eked out a living as a beggar, match seller, and occasional grave digger, especially during the great smallpox epidemic of 1827, and sometimes burglar. This was a particularly poor career choice, as he only narrowly escaped the death penalty. The Oxford University City and County Herald recorded the occasion. He was tried at Oxford on a charge of being concerned with others in a burglary. He tried playing the fool in court in order to get off and made most ugly faces at the judge, but it wouldn't do there. He was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged, at which Metal grinned worse than before. But here fortune favoured him at last, for a petition from his Banbury friends showed him to be generally considered an idiot, and then he received a pardon. However, his first entry into public notice was in politics. In 1818, Old Metal was put forward by the people of Banbury as a parliamentary candidate. Of course, this was simply a piece of political theatre on the part of the disenfranchised of the town. Banbury was a rotten borough which elected its MPs on the basis of a staggeringly small electorate. But one of the ways in which the population was persuaded to play along with the system was by laying on frolics, parades, dressing up, wearing favours, and plenty of free beer. Plenty of free beer, but no opportunity to vote. As well as begging around Banbury, Old Metal also took himself from village wake to village wake, where he might amuse the gaping crowds around him by playing the fool. Whether it always had connections with the local Morris teams, given that Adderbury was his birthplace, or whether they came together naturally as frequenters of fairs and wakes remains uncertain. But what was certainly widely recognised and recorded was his contribution to the overall performance of the Morris, to the point where it was actively sought out by local teams of dancers from Adderbury, Bloxham, and King Sutton. Old Metal distinguished and defined himself with a range of costumes and accessories, which seemed a constant element in his life and performance. His best known attire was that of an academic gown and cap, obtained apparently from an Oxford scholar. There are several accounts of him appearing in this guise, and it was in his costume that was painted, an image that was then widely reproduced in the form of an engraving. The mocking quality of the fool dressed as a scholar is obvious, as are the slightly subversive tones of the whole get-up. Less clear is the thinking behind the straw hat or bonnet of enormous dimensions, which some un-English lady had bought from Paris. This was adorned with ladies' curls and flowers. It's clear that Morris dancing was not without its rigours and dangers. And after a lifetime of performance, in 1841, we read of his death. On Wednesday morning, he got up and began to mend his patchwork that he might go to Adderbury. He had rested at a lodging house kept by Mrs. Thorpe, and as he sat by the grate, he was also nursing Mrs. T's infant. Suddenly he said to a little girl who was in the room, "Take the baby," and then immediately fell against the grate. The little girl, afraid, fetched her mother. The poor fellow rattled a little in his throat. The woman sent for a doctor, but before that aid could arrive, Metal was quite dead. A jury sat and returned a verdict of death from apoplexy. His age was 52 or 53. The surgeon who made the post-mortem examination stated that on opening the head, he found that death had been caused by an effusion of blood upon the brain, which had probably been accelerated by the exertions which the deceased had used on the preceding day when in attendance upon the Morris dancers. Back in Adderbury, the middle decades of the 19th century appears to show the greatest incidence of Morris dancing in the village's history, at least up until the present day, before it died out in the 1870s. There are many suggestions as to why Morris declined in the latter years of the 19th century, ranging from the economic to the social and cultural. Perhaps as one old-time dancer put it got too much like begging. Chandler reflects on the disreputable nature of the Morris dances in Adderbury and notes the efforts of the church authorities to eject them from membership of the bell ringers in the 1870s. He suggests that the antipathetic attitude of the incumbent, the probable withdrawal of patronage by the gentry, together with the difficulty of maintaining a custom at odds with the spirit of national recreation, all led to its downfall. William Walton appears to have been silent on the subject. Whatever the case, his dancing days appear to have been over, except for a final appearance on the lawn of Lahal Place, home to Janet Heatley Blunt, of whom we'll hear much more in a few moments' time. Thank you very much. Stop sharing and mute.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen. What now follows is a video of the Adderbury Morris Men performing Roast Beef of Old England outside St John's in Oxford on May morning. thanks to the Adderbury Men for taking that video for us. And now it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Tim Radford, who's going to talk to us about the revival of Morris dancing in Adderbury in 1975 and the changes to the dances and the music since then.
Good afternoon, everybody, whatever time it is where you are. I'm just going to but there we go. No, I can't get back to Zoom. Sorry about this. I'm having a problem with the getting back to Zoom. I can't figure out how to get back to Zoom.
Come out the presentation then, Tim, and go back to Zoom and then go into it.
Yeah. Okay, I don't understand why I can't get back into play the presentation and stay in Zoom. If I start the presentation, I lose my Zoom screen.
Do you want to start it anyway and see how it goes?
Yeah, well, I have started it. I've got one view up, but I can't get back to the Zoom screen.
Is Jan there? For second pair of eyes?
Yes, she is. I've got a full screen with the Zoom screen on it, with the presentation on it.
Press escape.
But I can't get at the Zoom update.
Yeah, we hear you. Okay, is that good?
Yeah, but how do I play my presentation now?
No idea.
We practiced this, didn't we? But
you are doing it from within by sharing the screen. You hit share screen at the bottom.
Oh, if I share screen,
Yeah,
that's what it is.
And that should pull up the choices. Yeah, do that.
That's what it is. Share screen. Okay. How do I get out of that? Go back to Zoom. I'm sorry about this, but I just can't get into the Zoom anymore.
Is there not a button that says share screen anywhere?
Yeah, but I've got something else. Share there.
Well, it's not sharing. There you go. That's
There
it.
it goes. I've got to play start. There we are. I do apologise for my inability to play with computers. So I'm going to talk about the revivals and going to show a few slides as this goes along. Some of them will be relevant and some of them won't be relevant. Some of them will be there so you don't have to just look at me. So before I start talking about the 1975 revival, I'm going to quickly mention the revivals that happened in 1908 and 1913 that happened in the village that are covered so well by the wonderful film The Way of the Morris. I've covered much of this in a Morris Matters article, but I'll summarise it as following. In 1908, a young woman from a minor aristocratic family living on the edge of the village, she was 21 years old, her name was Miss Frances Etienne Hoskins, with help from the local schoolmaster and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Walker, taught the pupils at the school Morris, maypole and country dancing, using what we assume to be Cecil Sharp's first Morris book, which was published the year before, in 1907. Their performances seem to have only occurred during the Empire Day that year, as you can see them with the hobby horse. The second revival occurred a couple of years later in 1913 when Miss Daisy Daking was asked by the vicar and with help from Miss Blunt taught Morris to the boys in the village, and some of these boys in the village went off to war and didn't come back again, and that was what the way the Morris talks about. You may have heard in the past and in other places that Brian Shepherd and I spoke to Charlie Coleman at the time of the revival. I have to say personally, I'd never heard the name Charlie Coleman until at least 1976 at the earliest, after the Adderbury Village Morris was reformed. But we'll come to that a bit later on as well. We also have to recognise that the old dances from the village were not actually collected by Blunt until 1914, 1916 at the earliest. So this would suggest that the dances actually taught by them on the early occasions were not Adderbury dances, but most likely those from Headington. This being the policy of the English Folk Dance Society at the time, of whom Miss Daisy Daking represented as part of the Oxford branch. Now we come up to date to the actual revival in 1975. One of the factors that prompted the 1970 revival was the very bad weather over the winter of 1973-74. I had moved to Oxfordshire in 1973 and been dancing with Oxford City Morris Men. Living as I did in Banbury, this meant a 26-mile journey to Oxford and back late at night for practice at a time when the Cherwell Valley seemed to be constantly shrouded in fog and mist. That's when it wasn't raining. I'd met several people at the local North Oxfordshire folk clubs, including Johnny Chris Leslie, Pete Kerr and Rob Widdup, to name but a few. And with my wife at the time, Annie's help with music, I was sure I could start a team within the area. I'd been on pilgrimages to all the Cotswold traditional villages, particularly Adderbury, but I knew no one there, and I didn't feel I could just march in unannounced and unknown and start a team. So Banbury seemed to be the best option and an alternative. I was beginning to think that dancing many different traditions was not the way a Morris team should operate, but that was the norm. But I wanted to start a single tradition team. But how? In early 1974, Annie was working at the Banbury Tech College in the evening classes, and she knew the head of the evening school. We approached him about a Morris class, and to our delight, he said yes. Then we arranged to have our first meeting on Friday, the 26th of April, 1974, and I informed all the likely candidates. Chris Leslie and Pete Kerr tried to drum up a few more, and on the first night we started teaching basic double and single steps using the heading tradition as a starting point. And the initial week was a success, I think, and the dancers eager to return the following Friday. Around the second or third or fourth week, I can't exactly remember where, the same dancers all turned up, and during the early part of the evening, a new face joined us. This turned out to be Brian Shepherd, who at that time was living in Wellingborough in Northamptonshire and had just started dancing with Walton Morris. Brian explained that he was born in Adderbury, which was only a couple of miles down the road from Banbury, and he had done some research on the village dances and suggested we move the whole class to Adderbury with a review of reviving the tradition. I was delighted, and everyone agreed that we would give it a try. From the outset, we all agreed to only learn the dances from the village, and I was over the moon at the prospect. Over the next week or maybe two, Brian did his level best to secure us a practice place within the village, and we agreed to meet on the 21st of June 1974 in Adderbury for the first official practice. Now, that week before, Brian had got permission from the vicar, the Reverend Vivian, to use the old schoolhouse on the High Street, now Shepherd's Keep. There's a picture of Shepherd's Keep. But come the night of the practice, the vicar told us that we couldn't use it because the floor was unsafe. So Brian had to scramble around the last minute to find somewhere else, and he quickly found a barn, at Neil's barn behind the pub, the Coach and Horses off the green, and we practiced there. And until we found some other practices, we also practiced for a while at the Bell, and then as numbers grew, we also danced at a Dutch barn at St Mary's Farm off the Milton Road, and also in the Village Institute, and as I said before, in the restaurant at the Bell Inn. Finally, on October the 4th, we found a permanent home in a double garage at Greenhill House, the Oxfordshire Cheshire home. Throughout that autumn and winter, we certainly had less time to travel, and I didn't really care about the fog. And from November the 11th, we'd started practicing Mondays and Fridays. Numbers settled down to about 12 dances with Annie as the musician. As we went through all the dances, Brian and I researched. I took on the bulk of the teaching and persuaded Annie to teach the other musicians the tunes. Brian, in his usual stalwart manner, handled everything else. We all settled down very well and spent almost every waking hour, while not at our paid jobs, together. The Bell became a second home, even on evenings and weekends when we weren't practicing. But this led to the happy conclusion of the first day of dance around the village in Adderbury on the very anniversary of that first night school class at Banbury Tech College. One thing I know for certain, without Brian Shepherd, all this would have turned out very differently. We were like brothers with a common cause, and we had the support of many great friends in achieving the outcome. I thank them all. They are fantastic memories I will have forever. What times. What has happened since is a whole other story, but I would like to think the old one is still the best. Here's the first dance outside the old wheat sheaf. Brian and I at the front of the set. And us at our home in 1975 at the Bell. When Brian first arrived, he'd already been told about the Blunt manuscripts, which are in the English Folk Dance and Song Society headquarters at Sesame Sharp in London. Barry Kerr of Walton Morris told him about them. He had also somehow seen the original Sesame Sharp manuscripts at Clare College, Cambridge, that are slightly different from what Sharp published in his Morris book. Sharp heard about William Walton from Janet Blunt, and Walton, as an 83-year-old, went to London to see Sharp, and Sharp collected the 5 dances with him that he published in his first Morris book. I'm putting up a few pictures so you don't have to look at me. As I said, he learnt the dances with more Carpley's there, and he published them, but there was only 5 dances in the original book. Constant Billy, Lazar Buncham, Sweet Jenny Jones, The Buffoon, and Black Joke. Sharp also mentions Happy Man and Postman's Knot, but there are no notations. Something in Mind also remembers that Sharp also mentioned Shepherd's Hay. Again, it doesn't appear until, I think, 1950, when Fred Harmer used it as a reference in the FDSS magazine. Blunt has started collecting from Walton in 1916. However, she also collected from Fred Webb in Bloxham in 1914, and we used the info for Staunton Wake and Old Woman Tossed Up as well. Blunt also had help collecting the Adderbury dances from Mrs. May Elliott Hobbs, Miss Daking, and Miss Phyllis Marshall. There's also a note in her manuscripts that suggests Walton went to London in 1916 and taught some dances to Miss Kennedy and her teachers. All these women were, I think, part of the Folk Dance Society and influenced by Sharp. I don't really know who the women were, except who they were. Bacon also mentions Miss Kennedy's manuscript in one of his sources, but I've never seen this source. When Lila Bacon's book first came out in the early 1970s, there were more details of the dances that came from the Blunt manuscripts that Bacon had got from Dummett. During those early years, Brian and his wife Chris and my wife Annie had gone down to Cecil Sharp House and copied the relevant pages from the blunt manuscripts. That is what we used to come up with the dances taught. There were significant differences between the two sets of manuscripts, and Brian and I looked through them all and decided what we were going to take and what we were not going to use to arrive at the style. And we used the sharp hand movements, but mainly the blunt figures. And these were used our experience when deciding what looked best. When Brian later left the team and started the Adderbury Village Morris, he only used the blunt manuscripts as his source. That's why the teams look so different. Again, from when Brian formed the Village Morris, they at first wore identical kit to us, but changed to their current set several years later. I think they needed a better and different identity. So let's look at, I looked in a photo that included in blunt manuscripts to show the top hats and a thinner baldric, and the use of green instead of red was a guess as the photos in black and white. I will add something about the manuscripts. We know that when Janet Blunt died and the family were going to burn them, but her maid, Winnie Wyatt, saved them from Cecil Sharp House, who deposited them where they are now. Winnie Wyatt had been Blunt's maid, but not at the time the dances were collected. However, she knew how important the info was. Here's a picture of William Walton showing the dances to the maids, etc. at Lahore Place. And William Walton, when he was the landlord of the Wheat Sheaf, and his brother, John Walton, dancing again for the people at Janet Blunt's house. So we arrived at a comfortable style, but why are there two teams in the village? I get asked this question often, and I will try and explain why there are two teams in the village. Oh, before that, there's a picture of Winnie Wyatt before she died with her husband Fred, opposite her cottage and next to Lahore Place. We used to dance for her every year when she was alive. Why are there two teams in the village? I really don't like to talk about the split, but we recognise that it happened in August 1975. Basically, at the first AGM, there was a number of items added to the agenda by Brian. These included armbands should be tied in a bow at the upper and lower arm and elbow. If an Adderbury dancer, you should not dance with any other team. There was a move to have no female musicians. Members were not allowed to dance to electric music. And there were probably a few others, maybe talked about only people who lived in the village dancing for the team. Basically, none of these items were adopted by the team during that first AGM, leaving the three village-born dancers, including Brian, in the minority. They then told me at the performance the following day at Swerve for Flower Show, they would be leaving the team because of the decisions made at the AGM. These three members became the nucleus of the Adderbury Village Morris, and they recruited only members who were born and lived in the village. They danced for the first time in April 1976 and have been a separate team ever since. Now, obviously things changed after there was a split to the team. Obviously we needed a new bagman because that would have been Brian's task, and Colin Foran took on the task of being bagman. I remained foreman, but I wanted the team to elect a squire, but the team would only accept me to fill both roles. Now we had major rivals in the village as dancers, and we wanted to be the best, so some major changes were made to the way we danced. The revival team had already slowed down the music speeds, not a la Ducklington or Jorrocks levels, around 80 beats a minute, and this was continued and emphasised, resulting in a higher dancing step with less travel across the ground and the figures. It was no longer necessary to spend a lot of time teaching the dances. We began to pay attention to dancing, spending much more time on stepping and figures. Concentrate on being one team, not 6 individuals. Learning individual skills so that team skills become easier to obtain. We also started looking at correct carriage with upright posture and balanced head and hips and shoulders moving the same relative distance off the ground. I would nearly always start a practice going over one certain aspect of the dances, e.g. side steps, and then put them into context within the dances, and thereby learn the dances and also understand the elements that made up the dances. We also would improve and work on transitions between one step and the next. Stick handling also became a focus, as these made up at least 50% of the dances. And we began to use hand sliding techniques to maximise the area of the stick to be hit, providing the ability to stick more vigorously. Right became the rule. We had always decided with the revival team all dancers would start with the right foot, except for the exceptions. Also, right shoulder first, right hand first, etc. Then learning the exceptions was also a part of the putting together, and we drilled these exceptions in practice. And this is why the team was able to cope with such a wide variety of steps, like double steps, single steps, 1-2 hop in Happy Man, the Sweet Jenny Jones step, etc. It was a matter of understanding the dance elements and how to put them together. We had from the inception added to the repertoire, the first being the bell that was written to mark the revival, taking the tune from the church bells and calling it the bell after the pub, our second home, and making it our corner handkerchief dance because we didn't have one. Generally, after the first year and Brian left, we found more dances. The bell, generally after the first, I said that. However, we began to create dances that had choruses that didn't exist, and we filled the gaps to make shows much more important. In addition to the bell, we had a Young Collins tune in 1976, was called various things depending on where and when we danced it. It was originally called the Howard, a pub in Ilmington, to a tune Lost that Chris Leslie wrote. We did Betty Windsor for the Jubilee, the anniversary jig for 1979, Blunt's 120th birthday. Also Bethlehem, when we could do the dance when Chris was not around to play the fiddle. Lollipop Man, while on tour with Strayed Morris in Mizardine, as a joke. We did a dance called the 17th of May at practice, for practicing side steps, and it just happened to be Dave Morris's birthday that day, and the tune comes from the John Clare Connection and Cuckoo's Nest, which came out on tour with Born of a Morris. And of course, much later, The Whole Place in 2000, it wasn't 2002, 2001. It was also me that came up with the way to dance our recessional, Shepherd's Away, that's based on Shepherd's Hay to our hand clap dance. Chris Leslie wrote some of the tunes for the dances above. Otherwise, traditional tunes were used from varying sources. I suggest you have a look at my book, which was published through the Morris Federation and is still available from the Morris Federation. I mentioned Chris earlier, and we should not forget his fiddle. As I said, Chris wrote the tunes, and most of the time, just on the spot while we were making up the dance. Some movements, as the movements were created. There was one I remember he wrote after we had dinner, our wives and us had dinner at my house after consuming 3 bottles of wine. I will now pass you over to Chris. Well, I think Keith first, and thank everybody. But this is a picture of Brian and I the last time we spent time together in 2020. Thank you very much. I'll pass you back to Keith. I'll stop share.
Well, thank you, Tim. You've already mentioned Chris Leslie, and it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Chris. Talk a bit about how he plays the music for Adderbury and some of the tunes he wrote. I've just got to find him. He's here somewhere. He seems to have disappeared.
you just
I'm
want him
here.
spotlighting, Keith? He's at the top.
Sorry?
Do you just want him spotlighting?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's at the top of the list. Oh. Very, very top.
It's on the top of my list.
Oh, okay.
Hang on. I can't see him. I can't see him. You there, Chris?
I am there.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, you've got your screen off, Chris. You've got
Have
your
I?
camera's gone off, yeah.
My camera's, there you go, my camera's gone off. What will it do? I'll tell you. If it can, it will. There you go. I haven't touched anything. Honest.
Still looking for you.
There you go. Great. Well, it's great hearing about the early days, because for me, they were so important. They were such a big part of my life, and have changed my life incredibly. My brother John took me to the first practice at Banbury Tech College. We both went along there and loved it, absolutely loved what happened. And after Brian coming along and suggesting the joining of the two groups, brought me out to Adderbury, and it was just a wonderful start. I remember the practices were so exciting. We just couldn't wait for the Friday night to get out to Adderbury and do all that kind of interesting groundwork. And I can see you, Keith. I don't know why, but I can see you. But that's all right. Okay. And the groundwork was really learning the dances, of course. But I decided to really concentrate, probably being a fiddle player for the side as well. So once I'd got the dances in my feet, so to speak, I took my fiddle along, and I didn't read music back then. And so I learnt most of the tunes from Annie Radford's wonderful concertina playing. And I learnt a few tunes from Brian Shepherd. And that was my starting off as playing Morris, playing for the Morris dance. But before the Adderbury side started, I'd always been a regular as a young teenager in Bampton for the Whit Monday dance. And I particularly loved the fiddle styles of Arnold Woodley and Matt Green, a very young Matt Green. And I decided that I wanted to take on board some of that rhythmic quality, some of the lift. They had fantastic lift to the dances. And I kind of saw how the dancers responded to that uplift, or kind of pushing up in the air kind of vibe. So I based my kind of style for playing for the dancing on that lift, and I took it to a further step maybe, and I decided that the rhythm for me was more important than the melody. The melody provided interest, but it was the rhythm that was the key for me. So I was slowly developing a style that was very different from my usual style of playing, in as much as I was using a pair of strings to play most of the time, known as double stopping in the trade. So I would be playing the melody on one string and usually using the string below that string as a continual drone. So both strings were driving with the rhythm to produce the uplift. I'll play something for you. I've picked a couple of rhythms to show what the style became. I'll play a little bit of Constant Billy to show us a 6/8 feel, a jig feel. But you'll hear the droning in it. So you hear lots of even space between the notation. And for more of a 4/4 feel, it went a bit like this. This is Staunton Wake. So it very much had it had volume, and it had rhythm, and then the melody was kind of the very close behind third importance. And I also found a way of watching the first pair of dancers in the set, either the calling dancer or the opposite number in the top pair. And I found if I watched the feet, paid real attention to the feet, and kind of tried to pick up on where they were setting their pace and seeing how they were moving to the pace I was setting. So very quickly, once the dance started, it kind of came to a meeting point, a meeting ground, where I found that if I could achieve that point where it wasn't too slow for the dancers, or I wasn't pushing them too fast. If we both met in that very comfortable area in the center, it really produced something very flowing and made the thing move quite with more energy than it should have had, if that makes sense. So that was my kind of way of getting into the style of fiddle playing for the side. I also was very influenced in my Bampton visits by Matt Green's solo jig with his fiddle. He would dance and play at the same time, and in my youthful enthusiasm, I decided I would really want to take that on board as well. And so I came up with a version of Jockey to the Fair as a fiddle playing and dancing solo jig, which I've done every day of dance, at least, even though I don't get time with the side very much these days, but every day of dance I've managed to at least perform that during the day's rounds. And occasionally having danced it together with Matt, doing a double jig of both our dances, which has been very lovely at Bampton. One thing to say more about those early days of the fiddle coming into the side was that the first fiddle I used for all the rehearsals and the very first day of dance and all that kind of part of the first year out was a violin that I cherished. I bought specially for the Morris. It was very loud. It was Japanese made, very good fiddle, great for the Morris, very loud, stayed in tune in all weathers and all that kind of thing. And I remember one day we were dancing outside a pub in Great Walton, just outside Banbury village there, and I'd put my fiddle down on a bank to get into the side and have a dance. And there was a car that was couldn't wait to leave the car park. He couldn't wait for us to finish dancing. So he saw a shortcut, and you've probably guessed it, across the bank where my fiddle was. And mid-sticking, I think it was, I heard the loudest pop I've ever heard. And it was the loudest the fiddle ever was, actually. It was the loudest noise it ever made. And he drove straight over the fiddle. And I turned to see Morris dancers hanging onto his car. They stopped him, but of course, he wasn't really interested in what had gone on. And so the outcome was the fiddle was matchwood and don't have it. And so it's a really sad thing. So at this stage of the revival now, I'd love to have still had that fiddle that experienced all those early days. And if you glance at the black and white photograph in the very opening of this talk and the very few early dances of me playing, that was the fiddle. But sadly, I don't have it anymore. But I think we'll play a video now of my solo jig, Jockey to the Fair, that I performed in the garden here in Adderbury a year ago. I actually did it again yesterday, but it was too soon to get that video in. This is from a year ago in our garden here in Adderbury, Jockey to the Fair. Thank you very much.
And here's a little bit of Adderbury Morris, a solo jig called Jockey to the Fair.
Well, Chris, I think that was absolutely amazing. Very good balance at the end there. So the Adderbury Morris Men are very fortunate to be able to call upon so many talented musicians to play from them. In fact, the Adderbury Big Band on the Day of Dance is famous. You've already heard from Chris about how he plays the fiddle for the Morris, and I'd like to introduce Dave Moore, who will continue with his theme. He'll be followed by Stephen Verner-Wass on melodeon and fiddle, and Stephen will also touch on the Adderbury singing dances. Let's find Dave Moore. This bit, there he is. Over to you, David.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for that, Keith. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I became involved in the Adderbury Morris, and then a few thoughts on the history of the music up to where we are now. So to start off with, in 1975, after the closure of the Blues Attic in Banbury, which was my regular music haunt, alternative live music venues were sought, including Banbury Folk Club. And I happened at the time across a fledgling Morris side practicing in a large garage in the Cheshire Homes before retiring to the Bell, where music was abundant. This was really exciting, as Chris has already mentioned, and it aroused my interest. However, and now I'm going to go into share screen. All being well, share, yes. So, however, in 1976, I accepted an offer of work in the emerging oil state of Dubai. So a fiddle was purchased with the intention of learning dance tunes inspired by Chris Leslie, Morris On, son of Morris On, and so on. I was surprised and delighted to discover that a Morris side already existed in Dubai, but they informed me that they already had a melodeon player and a fiddler, so it was suggested that I should learn to dance just until the need for a musician arises. Needless to say, I never played a note for the Dubai Sharjah Morris. I danced with them for 13 years and was squire of the side for 7 of those years. Fortunately, during that time, I realized my forte was not the fiddle, and I stumbled upon the tin whistle and taught myself to play. In 1989, I returned to the UK and settled in King's Sutton, which is near Adderbury, as you see on here. And by now, having become a fairly competent whistle player, whilst attending a folk club in Bloxham, I rekindled my acquaintance with Tim Radford. Tim asked if I would be interested in playing the pipe and tabor for the Adderbury Morris. My involvement in the Morris to date in Dubai had been fairly isolated from the mainstream UK revival, and I'd never even heard of the pipe and tabor. Fortunately, Tim produced a 3-hole tabor pipe and suggested that I borrow it and try to learn to play. Interestingly, subsequently, neither of us have any idea why he had one, as he doesn't play. I still have that 3-hole whistle today, together with now a sweetheart in Plum and Charles Wells in Boxwood. In a further quirk of fate, I came across a much earlier resident of my village of King's Sutton called James Blencoe from 1778 to 1863, described in the census variously as an agricultural labourer and a hawker, but who also played pipe and tabor for the Adderbury Morris around 200 years before me. I've been privileged to play pipe and tabor for the Adderbury Morris Men now since 1990, and in all that time I've never danced, although it should be remembered that I did start to learn to dance the Adderbury tradition with the revival back in 1975. So, having set the scene of my involvement in the Adderbury Morris and how I come to be playing the oldest instrument known associated with the Morris, I would like to indulge in a few further thoughts pertinent to my role. The pipe and tabor is a unique musical instrument combination whose origins date back to Neolithic times and here in the UK, at least as far back as Roman times. The oldest surviving instrument was found in Poland and dates back to the 11th century. The instrument was once highly fashionable in aristocratic circles, but over time in England, the instrument became more associated with rustic and folk music. The pipe is a diatonic instrument with a range of around 12 notes, or an octave and a half, although it is probable that bucolic homemade instruments would have had a more limited range. It's always accompanied by a tabor drum of various sizes, the usual Cotswold variant being referred to as the Bucknell tabor, from Joe Powell of Bucknell, which in many cases may have started life as a garden sieve or cheese mould. The combination was known colloquially as the whittle and dub. According to research by the Pipe and Tabor Society, it is likely that before the 17th century, the performance known as Morresque, which predated what we would recognise as Morris today, would probably have been performed to just one single tune, predominantly played on a pipe and tabor. By the mid-18th century, many rural communities supported Morris dancing teams that would be recognisable as such today. Musicians were rarely associated with just one team and probably relied heavily on the income from playing from many sides based within their catchment area. It seems likely under these circumstances that teams would in all probability match their dance figures and stepping to go with the tunes from the musician's repertoire. Two taborers known to have been employed in this way by Adderbury Morris in the 18th and 19th century are Joseph Woods of Deddington and Jim Blencoe of King's Sutton. Joseph Woods was a popular choice and is said to have played to all villages within a 25-mile radius of Deddington. Anecdotally, it is recorded that a taborer around that time, one Nelson of Steeple Aston, about 5 miles from Adderbury, was said to have been a talented performer, but was known to get so drunk that he couldn't stand, so had to be tied to a tree so that he remained upright whilst he continued to play. There is no record that he ever played for Adderbury, although the spectacle was recreated a few years back as part of a history talk given in the village by Stephen, and I was tied to a tree on the village green and played whilst pretending to be drunk. Emphasis on pretending. The pipe and tabor endured as the primary instrument of the Morris until the 19th century, after which time it was almost universally replaced by instruments with a much greater musical range and dexterity. By the time the Adderbury dances were collected by Janet Blunt in the early 20th century, she noted down about 17 individual tunes, each associated with a specific dance routine. These tunes would have been passed down over generations from taborers to fiddle or melodeon players, where they were finally noted down on a piano by Miss Blunt from the singing of William Walton. Some were inevitably noted down in keys unsuitable for the pipe and tabor and included notes outside the range of the D pipe. Additionally, since the revival in 1975, there have been a number of new tunes added, mostly composed by Chris on fiddle, and it's a tribute to Chris's skill that they are all playable just on the limited scale of the pipe and tabor. By happy chance, one tune in particular, Anniversary Jig, sits so well on the tabor pipe that I originally imagined it to be an old tune. I think it would be very interesting to have an insight into what Jim Blencoe and Joseph Woods played for Adderbury Morris 250 years ago. Traditionally, the taborer leads with the tabor drum and playing a rhythm that relates directly to the footfall of the dancers. I believe it's essential as a musician playing for dancers to know the dances. And in that respect, the years served with Demise and Morris provided a good foundation to my present role. In Adderbury, as has been mentioned, we're blessed with a number of talented musicians, and most frequently 3 or 4 instruments are played together for the dances. We are the Adderbury Morris, and that's what we do. So that's the Adderbury tradition as it exists now. It is interesting, however, to occasionally see dances performed to solo musicians, as each instrument has a very different impact on the performance and lends a contrasting tone to the occasion. So Thank you for listening to my ramblings. To conclude, I'd like to just recall one of my most memorable experiences playing for Adderbury on May Day morning in Oxford a few years ago, playing my whittle and dub as the sun was rising on the honey-coloured stone of Oxford University, the solo pipe and tabor music echoing around the cobbled streets together with the dancers' bells. I felt truly privileged to be a small part of this tradition of the Adderbury Morris. I'm now going to play my favourite tune from the Adderbury repertoire, the aforementioned Anniversary Jig, composed by Chris Leslie, before handing you back to Keith. And I'm playing this live, so excuse mistakes. Thank you. Back to Keith.
Hello, me again. So now we've heard from Chris and we've heard from David, and now we're going to hear from the other musicians who play for us on a regular basis, Verna and Stephen Wass.
Hello, everybody. David has obviously highlighted the importance there with his pipe and tabor of the percussive nature of the music for Morris and fitting it to the dancing. And Chris spoke eloquently about how he worked at achieving that with a fiddle. All us aspiring fiddle players, of course, have been inspired by Chris in that respect, in having that aspiration. We're going to play a couple of tunes for you from the traditional repertoire of the team, which I think illustrate that particularly well, both with fiddle and melodeon. And I think one of the clues here as to how that comes about is that both of these tunes are from Adderbury's singing dances, not the dances that are sung right the way through, but the dances that have songs attached to them, most of them ridiculous songs that make no sense at all, but which are sung by the dancers in advance of starting the dance. These tunes are both very percussive and fit naturally to the fiddle and the melodeon. But also having the dancers sing them before they start is one of those useful ways of helping to establish the rhythm before the dance actually starts. And as a teacher of dance, I've found them inordinately useful in teaching Morris, because if you sing the tune, the words to the tune, you're immediately internalizing the rhythm of the music, which when you're learning to dance is quite hard when you're trying to fit your steps to an external music source. So these two, we're going to do Washing Day and Lads a Bunch'em, and we're going to sing them and we're going to play them.
Ready? Thump, thump, and scrub, scrub, and scrub, scrub away. The devil a bit of peace I get upon the washing day. dear mother, what a fool I be. 6 young fellas came a-courting me. 3 were blind and the others couldn't see. Oh dear mother, what a fool I be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen and Werner. And as you mentioned, the Adderbury singing dances, we couldn't resist slipping in a short video of us performing one of those dances for you.
He can laugh, dance and sing and smoke without fear. He is happy as a king till he hails the new year.
I did say it was very short. Adderbury Morris Men may be a one tradition team, but as you've already heard from Chris and Tim, that doesn't mean it hasn't evolved over the years. So I'm now going to introduce David Gumby, the current squire of the Adderbury Morris Men, to bring us right up to date.
Thanks, Keith. I'm going to talk about Adderbury over the time I've been involved with the side, which spans the last 30 plus years. I'm going to share screen. Bingo. Okay, when I first became aware of Adderbury, the side had settled down to a comfortable middle age. Some of the original members from the revival had moved on, and some very capable new dancers had joined. Adderbury had appeared by invitation at Sidmouth a couple of times, the last time in 1988. I recall a conversation with Tim around this time when he described Adderbury as having moved from being about the pursuit of excellence to being about continuity, something he considered a journey followed by many Morris sides. An interesting discussion could be had about teams who managed to pull off the happy trick of both excellence and continuity, which would leave that one for the bell over many pints of hooky. This is not to say Adderbury were not a very tough Morris side. The team had been dancing together for a long time, had learned the tradition together, and had a powerful presence that commanded attention. This is something I hope we can still manage to pull off occasionally. Adderbury were not as active in this period as during the early days of revival. From days of practicing twice a week in the run-up to the first day of dance, practices were now held monthly and sometimes not even that frequently, as some months only Tim and Steve would turn up, so most of the evening was spent in the bell. The side were hardly overexposed to the public. I recall Tim saying there were 3 events which were essential: the day of dance, Kirtlington Lamb Ale, and the Stowe Tour organised by Sherborne. Anything else was a bonus. My recollection is that these 3 events are all we did one year after I joined. Certainly Adderbury didn't then, and still don't, follow the model of dancing out instead of practicing every week through the summer. Members of Adderbury were also dancing with other teams, principally Kirtlington, so were able to top up their Morris fix there. The infrequent practices posed a problem for anyone wishing to join the side and learn Adderbury from scratch. One way around this was to have learned Adderbury from Tim's Adderbury Tradition book with another side, which is the route I and 3 followed before joining Adderbury. We'd test-driven a proof copy of the book with Long Itchington Morris to see if it made sense, and also had the benefit of a day-long Adderbury workshop with Tim and Steve. As a result, we already danced Adderbury in the style of Adderbury before joining. This slide is taken of the day of dance about 1992. There's a rather younger version of myself in there somewhere. The slide also illustrates another way of gaining new dancers, bring on the next generation and teach them Adderbury from the cradle. The three young men in the front row are all sons of members of the team. Those of you who know him can amuse yourselves by picking out a young Mikey Radford. This trend continued successfully to the extent that at a day of dance some years later, we were able to put up 2 sets of fathers dancing opposite sons. Tim left the USA in 1996 and a new squire and foreman were chosen. Adderbury don't change squire and foreman very often, and here you can see the full set from 1975 to date, 4 squires and 2 foremen. From left to right, Steve Priest, Tim Lawton, Tim Radford, David Gunby and Keith Norton. There was a further influx of dancers shortly after Tim's departure, totally unconnected I'm sure, and the side became more active. There was a 100% increase in practice frequency to twice a month, and with more members it was easier to get a slot, so we now perform about 15 times a year. There continue to be several events which form the heart of our dancing calendar. The Day of Dance remains central to our year, and this slide shows a good turnout for the 2008 Day of Dance. Yesterday would have been the Day of Dance in normal times. You've already seen a clip of us dancing at Oxford May morning, an event to which we have contrived to regularly receive an invitation. One insider's tip for any side invited is to have a dance like Sweet Jenny Jones in your repertoire to perform in Radcliffe Square. Kirtlington Lamale is still something we look forward to, there having been a strong connection between the two sides since their revival. We have a brief clip of us dancing Lads of Buncham at Kirtlington, featuring the concertina playing of Pete North, yet another member of the Adderbury Big Band. If I stop share. Oh, Pauline. I'm just trying to bring up the screen share again. That's not the current slide. Yes, it is. Okay. We started dancing around Cooperative Village during the Cooperative Festival, partly because, being honest about it, it actually goes a long way to financing the side, but mainly because it's a great place to dance with an appreciative audience and a lovely atmosphere. The following is a short clip of us dancing out the Red Lion on Saturday lunchtime. This is one of my favourite Morris venues, offering a narrow space for dancing, hardly any room for an audience, and a pub where it takes ages to get served. What's not to like? Okay, an opportunity to invent some new. Sorry, I'll start. I'm in the wrong place. Our charity tour of Stratford in September has also become a regular event. This commemorates 2 members of the side Two members of the side who we lost to cancer, Edward Priest and Colin Street. We continue to support the Teenage Cancer Trust and Catherine House Hospice in Adderbury, and I hope you'll consider making a donation at the end. The following clip shows us dancing the bell in Henley Street. If you look carefully in the background, you'll see Chris Hone shaking down the spectators for donations. Right, an opportunity to invent some new dances was presented by the Christmas Tree Festival held in St Mary's Church in Adderbury. We already had Bethlehem in the repertoire and devised a short set of dances to seasonal tunes. These varied in the first couple of years as we didn't write them down. When we came to rehearsal again the following year, we couldn't remember the dances or even agree on which tunes we'd use. We now have recordings of them. This is my favourite, Sussex Carol, with Steve playing. We now dance it to David playing on that well-known Morris instrument, the bagpipes, but unfortunately I can't find a recording of it. In 2000, let's just open this off. Yeah. In 2010, the women of Adderbury decided they wanted a slice of the Morris action, and with the help of Keith, formed Sharp and Blunt Morris with their own style of Adderbury. The three sides in the village continue to happily coexist and get together from time to time. This photograph from the day of dance in 2015 shows the three sides together and is taken on the lawn of the whole place, Janet Blunt's house, and shows the strength of the Morris tradition in Adderbury. A feature of the last 20 years has been the trips abroad. The first trip was to Latvia in 2001 at the invitation of the British Council to participate in British Week, a week-long festival of cultural and other events. And here we are in the programme, sandwiched between the Darts Convention and the Jaguar Car Club. High culture indeed. The visit was very successful and generated lots of press and TV coverage for British Week. Another trip was to the Marlborough Ale in 2005, where we not only danced but also competed in the World Aunt Sally competition. I've still got the t-shirt to prove it. Keith tells me this was the winning strike in that competition. Following the ale, we went on a road trip across upstate New York, dancing with sides in Syracuse and Rochester, and managed to take in a performance by Fairport, where we danced outside the venue. It was very odd to be in Adderbury kit meeting Chris 3,000 miles from home. A further trip to the US was made to the Midwest Morris Ale in 2011. This was followed by a week spent in Colorado dancing with Maroon Bells Morris. Robin and Ann Smith were amazing hosts, putting up the entire Adderbury party in their house for a week after Colin, our bagman, had somehow persuaded them that we were house trained. While in Colorado, we danced on the top of Pikes Peak, 14,000 feet up in the Rockies. This was probably the shortest Adderbury performance ever. We've been able to repay the hospitality of our friends across the water on several occasions. Among others, Maroon Bells paid a return visit in 2013, and Minnesota Traditional Morris, or MTM as I'd like to call them, came over a couple of years ago. A trip to India was undertaken in 2015, taking in a dance festival in Delhi, seen in this slide performing on stage. This was followed by a trip to Lucknow. Here's the programme for the Lucknow visit. What the programme doesn't show is the armed motorcade which accompanied the party from the airport to the hotel, which is about as rock star as it gets. Adderbury's visit featured in the Times of India. This is a section from the online report. Times of India was able to use Janet Blunt's birth in India as a hook to hang their story on. Other trips have been made to Romania, Orkney, Germany, and several to France. The most recent was to the Voru Parimstantsu Festival in Estonia. This is the largest traditional dance festival in Estonia. When we were there, teams attended from all over Eastern Europe and a dance group came from India. I would heartily recommend the festival to anyone. At the end, there'll be a performance of Bows of London City from there, and we give thanks to the festival for permission to include this. Before that, I would like to leave you with a story from a trip to Hennef in Germany, where we were part of a twinning event, also involving a youth choir from Nowy Dvor Gdansk in Poland. One evening was spent in an Irish pub in Bonn, and after dancing, we started playing some tunes. After a while, some of the Polish girls started dancing to the tunes we were playing. This went on for a while until the choir master, who was an older man in his 60s, called for silence. He then told us the story of his father, who had escaped from Poland to England at the beginning of the Second World War. After the war ended, he returned to Poland, and while his son, the choir master, was growing up, he was told of how wonderful English folk music was and that he must hear it someday. The choir master had never heard English folk music until this evening, and then he told us that his father would have been astonished and delighted that one day Polish girls would be dancing to English folk music in a German town. And then he said, and he was in tears by now, "It's the music which brings us together," to which I would like to add the dance. May the music and dance continue to bring together. Stop sharing. Pauline.
Thank you very much for that, David. That ends the formal presentation. But before we go, I would like to thank the Morris Federation for giving us the opportunity to present Adderbury Morris to you, and particularly Pauline for her advice and support. If you're interested in the Adderbury tradition, you can check us out on the Adderbury Morris YouTube channel. Please subscribe if you do visit, or our Facebook page, which we put up our future events and photos and videos of our dance outs. You can always contact us on Adderbury Morris Men, that's all one word, all lowercase, at gmail.com. And finally, here's a message from the Adderbury Morris Men to all of you who found alcohol too much of a temptation during the lockdown.
So fight, fight, fight the demon in the drink. Fight, 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 you're teetering on the brink. Lucifer is lurking in a port and lime, claiming dipsomaniacs at opening time. The thirst of sin is slaked with gin, and righteousness is quenched with Adam's ale, Adam's ale. So fight, 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 with all your might. Temperance must prevail. And we're drinking.
So, question and answer session. So we haven't had any questions posted onto the chat. So if anybody's got something they'd like to say or ask us any questions, please feel free. What are you doing up there?
I have one. Have you any idea how Sharp and Blunt came up with different arm movements when they both collected from Walton?
I can answer that one because I was involved with doing Sharp and Blunt. Sharp and Blunt are an Adderbury side, but
I meant Cecil Sharp.
Oh, Cecil Sharp.
Yes.
Oh, I don't know the answer to that. Tim Radford probably knows the answer to that one.
It just is the differences between the two manuscript descriptions. If you watch Adderbury Village, they don't do the hand movement like this. Sharp's description of it is something that is very difficult to follow. Blunt just says the arms go down and up. So we ended up doing it the way we do it, and they ended up doing it the way they do it. There's nothing to prescribe, except if you dance with my team, you dance the way I teach it. I hope that answers the question, Duncan.
Yeah, thank you.
You can unmute and ask a question if anyone wants to.
Yes, I have a question. I'm very impressed that the village, you did say it was a large village, but I'm astonished that it manages to support 3 teams. I just wonder how Adderbury Village Morris managed to keep going with such exclusive sort of criteria for their membership.
Certainly, I would say at the beginning, it was a pride that they took in making sure that people only lived in the village. That has been stretched over the years. I can't speak and I won't speak for them, but they certainly try to adhere to the fact that you either lived in the village or were born in the village, or you lived in an adjoining parish. But as I said, over the years that has stretched a little bit, but that's for them. We have always had a policy that if anybody wants to join, they can join, and we have and the Adderbury Morris Men have always welcomed anybody who wants to join, irrespective of how far they live away. People have moved away, like myself. I can't dance anymore, but I'm always back for the day of dance. But other people like John Eastman, who lives in France, and a few other people who live further away who used to live locally, come back, and we welcome them. We welcome anybody that wants to dance. I think that still goes for the current team. I'm sure Mr. Gumby could say anything different if he needs to on that.
Yeah, just one thing. We have a saying in the side. It's a bit like Hotel California. You can get out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
I've got a question from Jan Elliott. about someone mentioned developing the sliding arm movement to make the sticking stronger. How and when did that come about, and have you got any splinters?
That was certainly a movement that after the two teams became separate, it was something I started doing to emphasize. Probably I did it myself and thought it was a good idea and then taught it to everybody else. Certainly, it does give you the ability to stick more vigorously. I don't like seeing teams that just tap sticks. You have to stick vigorously. There's a very famous story of our full Mr. Lemaire who tried to walk between Tim Lawton and I while we were doing washing day under the in the market hall in Abingdon, and the poor soul got hit on the head with a full stick from Tim Lawton and was taken to 3 hospitals before anyone would see him.
Any more questions?
There's another one that Steve Roderick has posted. How many teams in the US have taken up the Adderbury tradition, in many cases involving it on their own? How do you feel about the tradition carried on by others and potentially changed?
Good question.
That's another one for you and David, I should think. Tim?
Well, can I say from the outset that when we first started, we recognised that we would be looked on slightly differently than some other teams that had started dancing, because we were doing one tradition and we were doing it in the place where the dancers came from and trying to replicate what the way dances were. So we tried to be as good as we possibly could. And my mission at the time was to promote the name of Adderbury everywhere. And I still wish to do that. Which is the one reason I wrote the book in the first place, so that everyone could understand what we were doing and could try and replicate it. And I'm happy to see everybody dancing Adderbury, whichever way they choose to do it. I have ways and the team has ways of doing it, but if somebody else does it differently, then that's their prerogative.
Can I just say, I would concur with Tim that sort of Adderbury is Adderbury's gift to the world, and it's gone out and people can do with it what they want. When we went to the States, we were quite taken aback by being invited to join in with South Australia in Adderbury dance. And we all looked at one another and went, what is this South Australia? But it is what it is. People take it and make of it what they will.
Any final questions? Anyone?
I'd just like to say my daughter just said it. It's the best tradition.
How much did you pay her to say that?
She did it to make you cry.
Okay, well, it just remains for me to say a massive thank you to Adderbury Morris Men for a fascinating talk. A lovely afternoon. Thank you with you all. It's been great.